Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shub, and together with my partner and co host Patric, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Patrick, we're back again. As we said in the last episode, we're back very soon. Of course, our viewers and listeners will see this a week later or a week after our previous episode. How have you been in the very long time since we did the previous episode?
The last 24 hours have been awesome. Very, very good
Nice.
24 hours. Yeah. Actually, fun fact, Germany today officially announced that they have a 2/3 majority in the parliament for the defense and infrastructure
Oh,
SPV. So it looks like it's happening. So that's making it good
the
24
one
hours.
with the 500 billion euros, or was it even
Correct.
more than that? Okay,
Yeah, I think it's still 500, but I have to make sure I'm seeing the latest release that the three parties put out.
nice.
But the one that was in discussion was the 500. Yeah, exactly.
Very nice. Very
You know, we
nice.
say in our intro, it's a show about nothing. I think today is going to be the exception. Today, I feel like we actually have a very interesting premise about construction tech and robotics that you and our Asia team under your guidance, as well as our robotics wizards internally, especially
Yes.
Gabriele, have been looking into and championing. And I feel like finally it's coming to a point where it's worth talking about it because it is so unexpected to
Yeah.
think about construction robotics coming from India specifically. Historically, that's not what people were used to. So
Yeah.
we're going to talk about that. And Shub, to launch us off here, perhaps give us a history lesson first. Historically, you have been investing in India since when? 2015?
Yeah. That's right.
2015, right? So originally seed investor with a generalist firm, became partner there, then did Z-Work, for example. We did Fundamental then in January 2019, and you've been leading our investments there for the last 6 years. So overall, you've been investing in technology in India at the seed stage, pre-seed, Series A for the last 10 years. You're the perfect man to tell me, hey, robotics in India, has that been a thing ever?
Not really, man. Not really at all. So in fact, in our minds, and I know it's a very crude and old school way of thinking about it. So in India, investing robotics has kind of been seen as a subset of hardware investing. And I know you in particular will probably react to that saying, hey, that's not fair and that's not the right way to look at robotics. Robotics is maybe closer to automation as a theme rather than hardware.
Or even
But that's how it's
software,
been.
but
Exactly, right? But if you if you treat that as part of the hardware investing block, that whole theme has attracted some money, but it feels like it's been a big money pit where nothing really comes out of it, right? In the sense, and it's not necessarily been for lack of trying, but just the adoption, the ability to monetize it, the ability to get through product development cycles. It just doesn't come through to any sort of completion or any satisfying conclusion. Now, there's been a lot of finger pointing. Founders are quick to point out that because robotics, hardware, you need to finance the development cycles. You can't really judge companies off of, for example, a seed or a seed and Series A, etc. You need to have, I guess, more patience, more patient capital coming in. And perhaps that is a problem with the ecosystem, but you know how it is, Patrick. It's very difficult to demand patience from an ecosystem which hasn't seen any results. So I guess it kind of works both ways. It could be a timing and readiness problem as well. But long story short, it's been a very bleak picture. And I must admit, I have been the one singing that song myself, even ever since we started Fundamental. So even in our early days, in fact, even within the first few months, first year or so at Fundamental, we spoke with quite a few firms in India doing robotics, 3D printing, hardware solutions, etc. And for the most part, that corroborated our view. In fact, I'm saying for the most part to be politically correct. I would say it universally corroborated our view, right? That we weren't seeing any sort of traction or adoption happening in these areas. I think the last year or so we've been, I think, caught a little bit by surprise. Not because things are suddenly becoming very, very large, but there is I would say a clustering of very interesting symptoms, very interesting aspects of a small but growing cohort of companies. And I must say, I was not expecting to see those characteristics from robotics companies.
Now, before we go into what's changed and what the recent observations are, Shub, stay with me in the past just a little while longer here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm stealing liberally from Bill Gurley here. Bill had his own saying, but I'm taking his meaning and I'm putting it into a slightly adjusted version of his words in my own words. The job of the VC is not to predict the weather. It is to observe where thunder strikes today. And I think that's one of the mantras that has shaped my career as an investor so far as well. And that means that, hey, I mean, when VCs are active in India 10 years ago, and the job was not to predict if robotics in 2025 coming out of India was going to be a thing. They observed, hey, what was actually happening right now on the ground, maybe visibility 12 months, what is the demand market doing? And that's my question to you. So the Indian demand market, has it ever demanded robotics? Because that surely shaped how much robotics companies in India could flourish.
Interestingly, there's always been, I guess, if you're like a corporate in the construction industry, as a wish list to demonstrate that you're getting technologically ahead, a lot of firms will say that they want to embrace robotics and automation, right? Now, the question is that actually coming through in terms of real world implementation, paying up for it, implementing it at any sort of scale? That I think has been missing big time. And to be fair, that is not me pointing fingers at the corporates or the industry in India. It's also, look, the truth is labor is very cheap and plentiful in India, right? And the default method of dealing with all of this has been to just fill any sort of, or to deal with any sort of gaps with more and more people. Of course, that creates more and more problems, and we'll probably discuss that in terms of quality of service. The skill levels are not quite there. We have plenty of people, but not necessarily. In fact, we have a deficit of skilled labor. So that creates its own problems when you throw a whole bunch of people at a problem where they don't necessarily have sufficient skills. Then you have the too many cooks problem creep up as well. And I think we have like this weird chaotic mess sometimes of thinking that you know what the fix is for a problem, but then not really fixing it perfectly and creating a new whole set of problems to deal with.
When you describe it like that, it reminds me of when I started my career. I worked for a corporate finance boutique doing M&A mandates, buy side and sell side. And one of the buy side clients that I was part of the team serving was actually at the time the largest solar module manufacturer in the world, a company that was only 4 years old at the time called Suntech.
Okay.
Eventually, I think years after I had left the firm, Suntech became insolvent. But the reason why I bring them up is this Chinese manufacturer was growing rapidly fast. They were a manufacturing company as well as a distribution company of solar modules. They bet on the right technologies, mono and polycrystalline PV, and they had 30,000 employees after 4 years. Can you believe that, Shub? Wow. Absolutely nuts. Chinese manufacturing footprint. This was 2003, 2007 timeframe, right? And they threw warm bodies at the problem, right? So they were saying, hey, basically we have a huge labor cost advantage. We all know the story, and that's exactly how it played out there. It reminds me of how you're describing, India in the phase 10 years ago, 5 years ago, to a large degree today, right?
Yes.
And eventually China then embraced automation in many of its manufacturing sectors, including this one. I mean, also, if you remember how actually the first iPhone generation, how those factories looked in China, in fact, you can have a debate whether you would call it a factory or just a mass workshop, right? And so over time, automation kicked in. Robotics played a role in that, in these Chinese manufacturers. And there were reasons for that. There was societal reasons. There was reasons, hey, what is the next step of efficiency? How can we maximize margins? Perhaps quality and skilled labor, and all of these things. And so because that hadn't been perhaps the case in India 10 years ago, I would posit, Shub, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing from you, the conditions in the local demand market were not such that robotics was mass demanded the way robotics, for example, in the 1990s was demanded in Germany to keep the automotive sector productive and make them keep up with the Japanese manufacturers, right? We hadn't seen those instances in India just yet. And so is that changing now?
Yeah, I think actually it's a fascinating question. And, at times I feel like the obvious answer to that question is yes, because there's so many similarities with what you pointed out with how, automation and robotics kicked in China and what we might be seeing in India today. For example, we're seeing rising incomes. We're seeing India being seen increasingly as more of a relevant player in manufacturing. It's sort of aligning itself with global supply chains as potentially being a provider of manufacturing services in different areas. I think even within our domain, we're seeing that happening in areas like construction, aerospace, specialized composites manufacturing, etc., which it's not easy to do. So it's fairly, I would say, mid to high-end manufacturing, and India seems to be stepping in to do all of these manufacturing. So I think in many of these areas, it seems like it is similar to perhaps the transition we saw in the early days of China. I think one thing where I would perhaps take a slightly more cautionary tone as of now is, all things said and done, I think while there are very promising signs, we're still dealing with a small but growing cohort of companies. And I always, this is my personal style. I always like to be a bit careful when extrapolating from a small cohort of relatively young companies to a judgment on the overall macroeconomic prospects of large countries. I would say, I think we still have a long way ahead for India to make a credible case that we're actually, properly emulating China's rise as an automation power. I think we have lots more to be done. But the select few companies that we've seen, I think there are very interesting signs that, if not as part of an economy that is following China's path, I think they may be positioning themselves similar to how specific Chinese companies rose in their respective niches.
I'll tell you one condition that I am observing, and then we'll talk about the space of construction robotics that you and our colleagues have been seeing for the last year coming out of India. So one of the conditions that I'm observing is, number one, you need excellent engineering talent. India has plenty of that, spearheaded by IIT and NITs. No, there is enough talent that is available to build high quality robotics by software type of companies. And the second one is that at least I fundamentally believe in, that this engineering talent sees opportunities to build robotics firms that are based on componentized principles. So the same principles how you would do software development. And they are sort of more interested in the more challenging nature of applying software in a componentized way to a hardware or an atomic problem, rather than let me see how I can AI apply to bits and pixels. I think both are happening in the world, and I imagine they are happening in India. Now, the third condition that you then need to be successful is you need a demand market that appreciates the outcome that you might be doing. And I think the Indian demand market, if I listen to you correctly, Shub, while it is maturing, perhaps it's not the demand market that these founders coming out of India would be looking to. Are you observing that these two conditions are sort of getting satisfied out of India for construction robotics specifically, but they are looking into other markets? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, I think you articulated it perfectly, Patrick. It's what we're seeing, especially, sorry, just to take a step back, the interesting aspect of the cohort of companies we're seeing doing well, they've all been kind of on the journey. So the cohort we've seen who've been through the struggles, the range of the age of these companies you looked at, even though you may still think of them as relatively early stage companies in terms of where they are and what they're looking to raise, etc. but they are between 6 and 11, 12 years old, right? So
Okay.
this is the range we're talking about. So when you compare with, let's say, tech ventures in most other areas, this would be described as a Series B, Series C to maybe post IPO company, right? Whereas in these areas, we're talking about a Series A, Series A plus kind of a company,
Mhm.
right? Um, in some of the cases, in fact, multiple cases, what we're talking about is a situation where, as you rightly said, engineers from IIT, they actually started this company while at IIT, and it was part of their academic project, which they decided to formalize as a company, and they've been kind of carrying on with it since then.
Mhm.
And for whatever reason, they chose not to give up, which is kudos to them. And I think we shouldn't ignore that as like an ingredient for why they might be inflecting now, right? They've kind of hung in there through the tough times, not getting much money, probably not being seen as exciting companies, etc. And I think now they're starting to realize they've become smarter about how to spot opportunities and be very savvy in grabbing them. So that includes, as you rightly pointed out, looking at India as a demand market, but not the demand market. So I
Mhm.
think what we always see is to position themselves as very opportunistically to all kinds of markets. So we're seeing examples where they're delivering projects in the US, believe it or not, right? I wouldn't have foreseen this,
Hold on, hold on.
frankly.
So, Indian construction tech, robotic companies delivering projects in the US. You are seeing that.
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. That's right, right? I couldn't have believed it myself as I'm saying it out loud until recently, but it is a fact. It is actually happening, believe it or not,
Mhm.
right? Delivering projects in the Middle East, that is perhaps less surprising, but that's also been happening more recently. Winning contracts from companies like Apple, for example, believe it or not, right? To manufacture AirPods and the like, that is also something that's actually happening on the ground. So these are Indian robotics and machine manufacturers who are doing new methods of manufacturing, new methods of delivering outcome as a service, um, which I find quite fascinating. And it's all snowballing with very interesting aspects. So I think if you go back 5, 6, 8 years, a lot of these companies thought the way they're going to scale is by selling robots. And you, of course, have championed the theme that this only takes you so far, in general in construction tech, but more specifically in robotics. And many of them have sort of realized, what they do is outcome as a service, but the interesting term that I've seen being used in India is more MaaS or MaaS, which is either machines as a service or manufacturing as a service, which again I find quite cool and an interesting way. And it's interesting that this cluster or cohort of companies we're talking about have all sort of figured this out on their own, eventually as what the market demands, and that is what has led to them finding product market fit. Um, yeah,
There's
I
another
realize. Yeah.
there's another condition that I really like about European construction tech robotics companies, and that is the talent that you need in order to succeed oftentimes is not an automation talent. It's
Hmm.
oftentimes not a talent that has worked on building the hardware side of robotic systems for the last 20 years. So that has worked for a large robotic company that develops robotic arms or whatever. Oftentimes, I find myself more excited and more convinced by teams that come from completely lateral software backgrounds and product
Mm.
backgrounds and that see the robotic opportunity as a product problem and a componentization problem the same way.
Hmm.
Now, those talents, if they are great, will hire more and more software engineers. And those are
Mm.
expensive in the US, have been for the longest time. Let's see how AI
Yes.
changes that further. We are all observing the same thing here.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, you can get the same caliber of talent in Europe for a 3 to 4 time cost advantage over the
Hmm.
very strong ecosystems in the United States. Should India, it should be even more cost advantage, no?
So definitely, and I think we will eventually get there with these robotics companies. The interesting thing that I observe with some of these companies is a different direction, which perhaps is a refreshing change. So some of these companies will actually have two CTOs, Patrick, right? So there'll be one CTO designated for machines or robots, and another CTO designated for construction processes. And they sort of kind of work in conjunction with each other, but also in tandem, because the belief is you need a meshing of both. You cannot have like a pure robots person doing it, and you need like someone familiar with construction processes, and they sort of need to work together, especially in an outcome as a service involving robotics.
Why would that not be the CEO, the construction CTO? Why would that be the CEO?
So in these companies, and again, maybe this is a sampling bias because we are dealing with a cohort which is now several years in the market. The CEO has kind of moved. The CEO originally was also a techie in these companies, many times, starting off from their student days. But now the CEO has transitioned primarily to a client acquisition, sales sort of function at this point.
Okay, that sounds fairly advanced. So what kinds of solutions are you seeing in terms of construction robotics out of India right now? I know we see a lot get started and blossom, so I'm referring mostly to the things that have been around and perhaps hitting a stride now.
So this would be mostly stuff where they provide either robots or 3D printers or some sort of machines for producing either structures at lower cost and quickly, or highly specific specialized components. So let me give you an example. So this could mean 3D printing of an entire, of a small home, 3D printing of a villa or a facade or certain airport structures, or affordable homes. That is one use case. Another could be if you have complex parts used in aerospace, for example, or in spare parts, you could manufacture those in these machines. Basically, you just put it in a sort of mold, if you will, and it just kind of manufactures it on its own. It's like kind of like a factory of the future, if you will, as in the machines are more capable. Not to get too much into jargon here, but they kind of are comparable or maybe even more advanced than 5-axis CNC machines and deliver similar results, but at a fraction of the cost and time. So that's kind of like the claim as well. And another is also advancement in what sort of materials they can incorporate in the manufacturing methods. So for example, in the use of materials like carbon fiber for specific parts, where what I understand, and I'm by no means an expert at this, but what I understand is there's only so many options you have when you use carbon fiber as a manufacturing material, and there's new advancements in how you can use robotics and machines to produce advanced parts with these materials using these newer age machines at cheaper and faster.
Okay, got it. Okay, that gives me an idea. Now, you mentioned a few interesting things that you had observed that has sort of changed, or that has caught your eye, I should say, over the last year or so in these construction robotics companies. One of them, I think, was the economics that you had seen. So let's not talk about specific examples, but sort of let's throw it all in a pot, and you give us the, I don't know, the it's not a trend, just the aggregated observations.
Yeah.
What are those?
Yeah. So look, regular followers of the practical nerds would know that we love numbers that show execution excellence and which show a track record and which can be underwritten as a method for capital allocation. So, some off the top numbers that I've seen from this cohort, gross margins routinely excess of 50%, sometimes well in excess of 60 or 70%. All right. Operating margins, that is netting out labor involved, netting out power consumption, netting out any amortization in developing the hardware or the robots, any capex involved, netting all of that out, operating margins in excess of 30%. Right? When you net out all of these things.
Does that include the, I just want to make sure, the logistics, the setup times on site?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That is good.
Yeah. So in other words, you fully account for transaction costs and other overheads, as well as financing expenses for the hardware. You net all of that out, and you end up at 30% margin.
Sorry,
right?
Is that a? I actually don't know the answer, so it's not like you and I are playing theater right now, and I'm like, I know the answer, but I'm asking Shub for the audience. I actually do not know the answer. Is that on the projects these companies deliver in a region, but another region has different economics? So
Good question. Actually, what we found in examples is 30% is kind of, so again, there's a bit of a range. So there's companies which are lower than that. And there's also companies actually, believe it or not, significantly higher than this 30% that I said. And what some firms will also do is kind of report consolidated margin structure. So this 30% would, for example, also be consolidated. They could, for example, be extracting much higher margins when they execute projects abroad or outside India, and have slightly lower margin structures when they do it in India. That's also a thing. They could also, for example, because some of them still retain a small proportion of the business where they sell robots instead of offering it as a service. There's some lumpiness in terms of how the revenue gets recognized and the margin that yields. So there's some lumpiness there. But long story short, think of 30%. If you run like a robotics business with 3 or 4 different verticals and let's say 2 or 3 different geographies, think of 30% as what seems like an achievable operating margin.
So with that operating margin, have you seen EBITDA profitable ones?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So have seen EBITDA profitable ones, have seen, and this is something I could not have predicted, Patrick, bank debt getting ready to finance these companies, right? Which is usually a sign
like 6-year-old construction robotics companies.
Correct, right? So they are now prepared. So banks see this as a non-risky collateral in terms of the assets the company has and the cash flows and revenues they're creating. They see this as a or maybe non-risky is the wrong word to use, but they feel that they have enough
Bankable.
security. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, bankable is a good word. They feel they're bankable in order to extend bank debt.
Oh, and just to be clear, you're not talking about venture debt. You're talking about traditional bank loans.
That's right. So I find that quite fascinating, that I would not have predicted this coming, but it's already happening, believe it or not. And that usually is a sign of things sort of coming together in a nice, favorable intersection, and timing may be happening. Timing may be also coming together.
Is that because I'm trying to understand here the conditions that led to this recent culmination point, perhaps. And just to be clear, you're not referring to one specific example. It's a dozen or so construction robotics companies that, you're now merging the observations from. Yes, there is a range, but like we're speaking about the generalized or generalizable observation, actually. So I'm wondering, what is the causes of this culmination point right now? Is it that the technologies have been matured enough now that they can hit a stride? Is it that they have figured out a model and they use cheap labor in order to extract great economics? I'm probably making things up here, but what are the reasons for that?
I think it's a bit of all of this, but I still think it cannot be understated, maybe by sheer coincidence or luck. I don't think it should be understated that in these companies, they've somehow stuck around without getting too much funding in a founder-led setup, very frugal setup, still continuing product development in some shape or form. And in a weird way, the constraint of not having too much resources, not having much going, and yet having founders carry on, I think it's led to a very favorable intersection of things happening. Firstly, I think the founders have matured. I think some of the same companies that I'm meeting today with all of these observations, I have actually met them 6-7 years ago, Patrick. And I can tell you they were not the same company. They were not the same founders then, right? I can say that, even if, some of you founders you may recognize yourself, I can say it on the record. You were not the same person 6-7 years ago, right? And I think that experience has been transformative for these founders and these companies. And I have a feeling it's sort of creating a community which sort of derives pride and it's the word I'm looking for, confidence through each other's presence. Like if you see one robotics and machine company come up, I think finally they derive comfort knowing that, hey, they have some brethren that are going up, and they've sort of, it's like a closed loop where they kind of feed off of each other. I see some dynamics of that also kicking in.
Okay, that's interesting. And you didn't say something that I sort of expected to hear. but not because I know that to be the case. It just sounds very intuitive as like a, hey, that could have happened.
Mm-hmm.
The customers in the segments that these robotics companies coming out of, construction robotics companies coming out of India, serving abroad, these customers, are they better prepared to adopt robotics now? They actively look for solutions. They have created a buyer readiness internally in terms of the governance, what they look for. Is that a thing that is happening? And then these Indian robotics companies are perhaps more mature than actually Western ones because they have been going at this for a long time. Is that a thing?
I would say yes. I think the market readiness has improved or increased in an incremental fashion, and it favorably intersected with the companies improving the technology in a way that is better suited to the market as well. So what I'm trying to say is, for example, earlier on, they would come and say, hey, we'll build like one wall column for you, right? In so and so time and for so and so money. Keep in mind, in the early days, they were not even offering that as a service. They're trying to sell the robots. For cash flow reasons, or maybe that was the only model that made sense to them at that time, etc.
Yeah.
And the market was like, hey, no, sorry, not buying robots from you, right? Along the way, the business model has evolved. The market has expanded in terms of what it looks for. So interestingly, one of the companies we spoke with, a few projects they've done, they actually retain, and maybe this is like a geeky thing. For those of you who know how 3D printed homes look like, the final structure, they finish it, but they still retain elements which reveal the 3D printed nature of the building, because that's actually what we realized or what we gathered is there's a segment in the market which wants to kind of show that off as a unique characteristic of the building, right? So the market is also evolving where tastes are maturing and there's a target audience emerging who actually is looking for 3D printed homes, for example, right? Um, or homes done by machines and not by humans, right? Again, I know you and I have to do a lot of internalization from that observation, but it's like market maturing ever so slightly, expanding every now and then, expanding in terms of taste, in terms of spending capacity, the technology and the business model evolving, and we have mentioned this before, track record. The track record, obviously, the compounding has happened ever so slowly and ever so slightly, but just by virtue of hanging in there, I think some of these businesses have added credibility.
I'll give you
Yeah.
I'll give you one factor that I think a construction robotics team coming out of emerging markets or markets that for other reasons have structural cost advantages have a huge edge in. And that is, and by the way, this is a shout out to another founder that I've been spending time with the past few months, as well as the earlier years. We're not invested, but I respect a lot what they do. They're also in the manufacturing space for construction. And it's a term that you use in American football. And he introduced that term to me and it immediately resonated. It's called the repetitions or short reps. How often you're on the field practicing a certain play, practicing even a certain motion that counts as a rep. And the whole idea is that if you don't get the reps in, you will not reach near perfection. And the same thing can be said about construction robotics or other forms of automation of the manufacturing and the construction of a building. If you don't get the reps, how can you become perfect?
Yes.
In space, by the way, or space, the whole space economy, that is a huge opportunity if you figure out how to give companies the reps to build for space or in space and transport into it, etc. That is the key bottleneck, how to get a quicker innovation. And the other one is supply chain and logistics, but not talking about that. And so here it's the same. But now if you're in an emerging economy or another economy that actually has, for other reasons, a structural cost advantage, your reps will be cheaper. So this other founder, going to know that I'm referring to him. But again, we're never doing a show here about companies. So forgive me, I'm just not mentioning you guys. But they're in a structural cost advantage country with a large portion of their engineering, etc. And these guys have much cheaper access to land locally than they would in the target market in the United States. So if you wanted to build your track record of putting buildings in place and the learnings how to optimize, you would have to buy land that would be probably about 10 to 15 times more expensive than the same land in the country where they are. What does that allow you to do? It allows you to put in much cheaper reps, and thus you will get much more reps in a short amount of time as a construction robotics company. Shub, is that happening in India? Is that an effect here?
I think so. I think you have. I think you might be spot on with your hypothesis. It is. So look, I want to say, okay. I think it is cheaper to stay alive and stay in the game. And by virtue of staying alive and staying in the game, you are doing reps, whether you realize it or not. I think that has definitely happened.
I mean, to be completely... Sorry, I'm just thinking if I should say this because it kind of reveals... It's not a secret sauce, and I know that founder would probably not judge me for it because that founder believes it's all about execution, but it's just not my style. I'm not revealing any ingredients from other companies unless they... Okay, so let me actually skip that, but perhaps I can frame it in a slightly different way. So if you're a company, construction robotics, that needs to prove your track record to clients, the best thing you can do is move to outcome as a service, or MAS.
Yes.
Because now you're assuming the risk and you're guaranteeing the outcome. That still doesn't entirely solve the throughput with which you get reps. It only means, hey, that's how I can get my contracts, but not necessarily the velocity of my repetitions. Now, another way to do that is to become your own customer. So if you become your own customer, because you're actually building buildings, that requires money.
Yes.
It requires 10 times to 50 times less money if I'm doing that model in India than if I'm doing that model in the US. That's why no one is doing it in the US.
That is true. Yeah, that is true.
That's a real structural cost advantage to get reps.
That would be a fascinating direction for some of these companies, or an entirely new company perhaps to explore.
Yeah. So I think, Shub, it sounds to me like you're beginning to see here the culmination of interesting construction robotics companies coming out of India. One thing I will point out, the robotics founders community is a much tighter community than many other subsets of construction innovation. Robotics founders gravitate to robotics founders. It's just something we observe across the world. And so that's why it also compounds a little bit that the more you see, the more people come, etc. So we might be seeing that in India now, and it sounds like you're on top of it.
It certainly feels like that way. It feels like a lot of things are favorably coming together at the same time, and things seem to be now blossoming for a cluster of companies again at the same time. Usually these things are not coincidences. I think it's a sign of things to come. I think we are very excited by this development, and we definitely intend to spend more time and maybe back some of these opportunities.
Great. I certainly love capital efficient companies. So that's something that, perhaps they have in common.
Seems that way. Yeah.
Awesome. Great stuff. Well, thanks for sharing, sir.
That was fun. I look forward to repeating this next week, sir.
Yes, I'm looking forward to not seeing you in the next 24 hours.
Yes, I look forward to that as well.
Happy weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye, sir.